Hello and thank you for viewing our webinar on student transportation. My name is Michael Watts and I'm a financial specialist at EdOps. In other webinars in this series, you will hear from my colleague Shelley Jacobs. As we go through the presentation, please remember to consider the key inputs to making a strategic decision other than cost benchmarking. Here you can see the key questions you should be asking yourself in conjunction with the financial information presented. These questions are also available where you found the link to this webinar. In this part of the series, we will look at how much schools are spending on student transportation, the vendors used for transportation, and means of transportation used other than busing. Also note that the information that will be presented considers the aggregate spending on transportation, whether it is transportation for field trips or transportation that may be provided to get students and families to and from the school. Looking across the LEAs we work with, we found that schools on average spent less than 0.4% of revenue on student transportation, with a few outliers that spent upwards of 2.5% of revenue. You should also note that within this range, schools that spent the most on transportation were not necessarily the schools with the largest enrollment. This is an indication that there are potential vendor options or specific needs of the school that will influence the cost beyond the number of students. First, we could consider the type of transportation used by the school. Busing makes up the large majority of transportation budgets for schools, with smaller portions of spending going towards metro and rideshare services. There are many bus companies providing services to schools. We counted 46, and of those, 19 companies were used by more than one school. Given this number of companies, there is an assumption that schools should be able to pursue multiple quotes from vendors to ensure the best quality and price. We recognize that the service of each of these companies may not be to the same standard, so you should seek reviews of the listed companies before engaging a new vendor. Most schools also use more than one vendor to meet its transportation needs. On average, schools use 2.3 bus companies. As expected, we found that schools with larger enrollment used a greater number of bus companies. When deciding which vendors to use and how many vendors to use, consider the correct balance to service the needs of your school. Aggregating transportation into fewer vendors may simplify pricing and management of the transportation vendors, but using more companies may allow the school to more readily find vendors that match the specific transportation needs of the school. Some schools also met transportation needs via services other than busing. There were 16 schools that utilized public transportation for students, with 10 of those schools spending 10% of their transportation budget on public transit. 10 schools use ride-sharing services such as Lyft or Uber. Most used this mode of transportation sparingly, but there were a few schools that spent over half their transportation budget on ride-sharing in order to meet very specific needs of their students. While transportation may not be the most nuanced expense within your school's budget, it still merits significant attention due to the frequency and amount of transportation expense that could be incurred by the school. The main takeaways to note from this presentation is that there are many bus companies that provide transportation services to schools, so your organization should be able to pursue multiple quotes and utilize multiple vendors in order to get the best service and price. Second, enrollment is not necessarily the determinant of overall spending. If your school is spending over the average spending benchmark, you should think about whether there is a rationale for the variation or if there is room for your school to seek other vendor options. A further consideration is to think through who is involved in making these vendor decisions. Think about which staff members are involved in the decision and what controls exist around the decision-making process. Also think about whether these staff members have incentives to minimize costs or not. Thank you for joining us for our discussion on student transportation expense. Please review our other presentations in this series to learn about food service fees, contracted sped instruction fees, student recruitment, and contracted instruction fees.